my great pleasure this evening to welcome Ricardo Miranda Zuñiga, who's from the States and is here exhibiting his work.
Thank you, Claire. A lot of my work has to do with the immigrant experience and the loss of a cultural homeland, and my experience as a first-generation U.S. citizen of immigrant parents from Nicaragua and having grown up between Nicaragua and the United States. So what was installed here today was a video game, and in the video game you control a character that leaves his homeland to go to New York City and then tries to survive New York City. And the audio that was playing was interviews that went into building the game, interviews with a young activist immigrant, undocumented immigrant from India, and a young activist immigrant from Ecuador. And their voices accompany the video game. And these figures are also part of the installation. I'd like to begin with this quote from Shklovsky, from a Russian literary critic who coined this term of defamiliarization, this idea that the moment when art occurs is at the moment of perception, that you're looking at something and not understanding it and trying to understand it. And that more powerful than art as object, or more powerful than the process of making it, is this moment of communication that exists between the viewer and the work. And the surrealists, for example, ran with this idea of how do you take the everyday, how do you take the normalized modern existence that we live, and how do you twist it, how do you make it strange in order for one to reflect upon modernity or reflect upon the society that we've constructed. And so that's a point of departure in a lot of my work, which is why I like to borrow this quote from Art as Device, this 1917 essay. So I like using technology and finding ways to use technology in unexpected manners. And I also take a lot from street culture. I find the street to be an incredibly rich place for inspiration. And I also like designing work for the street because it's risky in the sense that I never know what's going to happen. If you put something or design something for the gallery, okay, you've got this nice object, you put it up, great. But in the street, you don't know how people are going to react to it. And that moment of defamiliarization, again, is really engaging. So this is the project that was installed here, a geography of being. And as I was explaining earlier, the audio comes from conversations that I had with two young undocumented activists and how they gained a sense of self-empowerment through becoming activists and stopped fearing authority and found a community of other individuals that had the same common reality, and through that came out and sort of started fighting for the rights to gain citizenship, because both of these kids, one from India and one from Ecuador, they were brought over as children by their parents. One of them never even knew he was undocumented until high school, when he was trying to get a job, and his father told him, you can't get a job because you don't have papers. And whereas the Ecuadorian kid, he grew up knowing and grew up fearing the police, and his mother telling him, stay away from the police, stay away from you absolutely cannot get into trouble, because if you get into trouble, you can be deported, and you won't be able to continue your life here. So what's presented in the game, by the way, there's these wooden figures that are supposed to represent the traditional nuclear family, father, mother. Or I brought here the third one, the sibling isn't here. Although the game, the way it works is that it's kind of a difficult game unless you have a lot of time. So there's hotspots in the game that communicate to the figures and present a looped playthrough of that section of the game. And that would allow people to play the game, and if they couldn't figure it out, they could walk away from the game, go look at the figure. And so both of them talked about their family as enablers, as people who helped them, guided them, through their lives and sort of told them of the reality and what they could and couldn't do. And so, and for that reason, the installation, the game isn't just the game itself, but also the installation consists of these figures. And I think I have some. So the game begins I plugged in some of my own personal history, and so there's some images that are rooted in Nicaragua, such as Didi who's an indigenous figure who fought against the Spaniards, the colonial cathedral in Granada. And you can't go right, you can only go left because the winds of change will spur you away from going right. And so one of the Ecuadorian kid talked about how much he missed football, that coming to the States, that was one of the hardest things for him, was the fact that if it was lunch or recess, he had nobody who wanted to play football. They all wanted to play handball or some other sport. And so the soccer ball, the football became a primary element. And so at this point, if we were in installation, the mother would be showing, okay, to get to the next plateau, you have to interact with the football, move it, and then use it to get to the next plateau. And then I borrowed from, this is from Goya, the garrotazos, and have these Spanish figures in the background who don't actually, you don't interact with them. They're just concerned with themselves. At this point in the game, this is first level, you have to sort of jump into the abyss. You have to leave your land and then you land into these gears, which are supposed to represent New York City. There's all these individuals running, constantly working. And if you guys are familiar with New York City, it's a place that's very intense about people. Even the speed that people navigate the streets is heightened. So you try to get past the gears fall inside a gear, and at this point you avoid these sort of these ghosts that are supposed to represent the powers that be, where there's the police, figures of power that you have to avoid or that one is afraid of. And you use these plateaus to fall into this rectangle where falling letters represent gaining language. So both of these kids talked about language being the hardest thing for them as kids, that they wanted to communicate, but they didn't know English, or at least the Ecuadorian kid didn't know English and needed to learn English. So one gains language, and then you make it up to the little redhead girl who's supposed to be like finding a playmate in the yard, somebody who will not ignore you or will not fight with you. And she will lead you to the Triborough Bridge. Both of these guys come from Queens. Queens is a borough that is densely populated with immigrants. And they both, one of them is currently in college at Columbia, and the other one has multiple degrees, but still is unable to find work. And so Queensboro Bridge will lead you to fall into another abyss, which is Manhattan, and you fall through the sky into Manhattan, and you end up underground. At this point, you have to use these other children to jump up plateaus. And this plays with this idea of community of people in the same reality, enabling one another. And eventually, you get back above ground, and you beat the game.
Wow, that's fantastic.
Yeah.
Great. We've got time for questions. If anybody has any questions now.
Yes. And I can put the game on if anybody wants to see the game.
Yeah, is anybody not good? Did you get a chance to see the game?
Yeah,
that would be good.
Would you like?
Then we could always come on and maybe ask some questions. Because I hadn't twigged that those figures over there were giving us shortcuts when we're playing the game.
Yeah.
So do people have to make that connection themselves while they're playing? There's a point when the figure will move, and you should notice that. They do have to. Well, when since the decision to present this was sort of last minute, I didn't have time to set up the servers and the communication. Okay. So they're not talking to one another. Okay, they're not talking
now.
Okay.
But when they are, people need to sort of put it together. But there's icons in the game that represent these figures,
okay.
And they'll start blinking when a corresponding one is showing you the game.
And that'll give you the shortcut. Like you get stuck at.
Yeah, I do.
The robots.
Now, actually, I'm gonna. Oh yeah, it'll make it. I didn't think the joystick input would make it, but it does.
Did you say there is another figure?
I was the only.
Yeah, so the sibling figure didn't travel.
You know, there was
malfunctioning,
that part
and
where my friends
female
like,
figures
knew me in the sense that,
malfunctioning.
oh yeah, he knows so much about basketball and he knows so much about this cartoon. But then,
So
you know, they'd be like, hey, Friday night is this football game. We're going to party.
so there's 3 levels. I'll start with the first level, and I mentioned that
Like that part.
had I gone right, it would have just pushed me to go the opposite direction.
That ended up being like, that was at like high school, you know, but even
At any point, to interact with the objects, you would push a button, and so you need these objects to move ahead.
me, you know, if I wanted to go out with her. That was fourth grade.
And then there's occasionally these creatures that you'll have
I was
to
really young.
avoid
And
or die.
I never really had to experience any like even like maybe because I kind of didn't really look at like
reactions you get
it kind of like it was never
game. Could people play it and just play it as a game?
Yeah. So the reason it's this type of game and not something more didactic is because before developing it, it was commissioned by the New York Hall of Science, and so I would visit the New York Hall of Science and see that the majority, by far, the people who would go to the New York Hall of Science were 7, 8, 9-year-olds through 14, 15, 16-year-olds. So I had to find a language or a project that would function for them and that they could get into and enjoy, while still, if they took the time to consider the game, would hopefully walk away with something interesting to contemplate. So, what I was told by the people who worked the museum was that it was extremely popular and kids would rush to play it. And then it was up to the people on the floor of the museum that they would try to explain what was going on and what this was about. So
The kids playing the game in the museum wouldn't have that voiceover for the interviews with the immigrants.
yeah, this was added for FACT. This was added for here, for Cities in Dialogue. So it's a new, there was a text explanation, but it wasn't available to the conversations.
Your son play the game?
Oh yeah, no, the visitors.
No, your son.
Oh, my son. Yeah, he has played it. Yeah, he likes it, and he's the main character. So he particularly likes it.
Do you think that your biggest influence is from the people? Like, is your interaction with the people like really influences the game and helps develop it? In a lot of projects, you can see how the way you take people's views and stuff and the way their lives, like you take their lives and then you put it into a lot of your projects. And it's really interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. In some cases, more directly than others. So, for example, with this one, it definitely was about the audience, and if this is going to be in a museum for 6 months, how can I present something that people will enjoy? And then similarly with several other projects, other times it's less pronounced, such as the public broadcast cart. Although I was inspired by seeing undocumented immigrants, pretty much, who were transforming the shopping cart into a mobile flower store. It wasn't necessarily through conversation, but also the topic of that project had to do with changes that the FCC, the Federal Communications Council, was making at that time. There's been 2 in 1996 or 97, and then again in 2002, were moments when the FCC totally opened up the means of communication for monopolization. So at that time, the rights of a company to own however many newspapers and TV stations and radio stations completely opened up, so that there's a very small number of corporations that own the means of communication. So that project was in reaction to FCC legislation and what I felt was mishandling of the forms of communication, which in the States originally, with radio, for example, was meant as a means of education, not something highly privatized.
Like the project with access.
Yeah.
But it's bringing people's attention towards like online access food.
And so ideally, there's a moment of conversation that occurs. It's like a lot of times, when I presented this, it was a myth. A lot of people were aware of what was happening with the FCC because it was headline news, but a lot of people were clueless or just didn't care. And so to me, it's like if you're getting all of your media from Disney, there's a problem, So whether the exchange happens before in the planning and conceptualization or after, it's really important for me that the work exists to exchange, not products that are closed.
Apart from Germany, did you bring it anywhere else?
No, it was popular in New York City and in gallery shows in New York City, but no, it's only in Berlin. I think. That project had long feet. It kept me busy for a while. Enough that when I was done with it, I stopped saying that. Yeah, I stopped. I was like, I'm not taking this out again.
It's interesting what you were saying, Ricardo, about when you transferred it to Berlin, you got different reactions and people felt differently about the public space and what was in there.
Yeah.
Considering we're thinking about citizen dialogue, and is it other things that work for some cities and don't, or is it artworks that work in one city space might not work in another?
Yeah, absolutely. I think cultural difference exists and is very pronounced in how people maneuver the public space. And so, like I said, in New York City, as soon as people figured out what this thing was, like this guy, it was a platform for him to broadcast his voice loudly, and so in cultures that are more reserved and don't want to be sort of this, people that have less of a desire to be this public persona, like in Germany, it just you need to rethink or reconfigure the work, I think. Otherwise, this was a funny situation where this guy didn't believe me until he went and ran and got a radio and then put it on the station, and only then he realized, oh yeah, it's working, and then he got on it. And what was interesting is you can't see it in this shot because of the parked cars, but this street feeds off the Lincoln Tunnel, and so cars were stopped bumper to bumper at this time, and I put signage as to the frequency, and I would pause, and I saw people pointing and actually putting their car radio to the frequency and listening to what was being broadcast.
Was it mostly talk, or did people perform different things?
Only in Berlin. It was pretty much all talk.
What did they say?
The conversations?
Yeah.
Most people just wanted to do a shout out to their family members. Or I had some programmed shows with activists and artists that I did a few times at public parks. And so we would agree on the time to meet if I was taking the project out, and we would have a conversation. Oh, it did travel. This was in Linz. So it was invited to Ars Electronica, and in this scenario, I brought a bunch of pocket radios and put them all over the square, and then if you've been to Ars Electronica, the festival takes over. It's a new media festival, and so it takes over the main square, and so all these projects are available, and here there's some Austrians talking about. I presented a series of questions to sort of stir on the conversation, and it's their reactions to, primarily to the war in Iraq. That's what I focused on. So it's 2004. Yeah.
What is this?
So I had to. So this is just a collection of various projects, and this is excerpts from interactive sculpture that's in the form of an ATM. So this was a museum commission, and it's this very sort of decorative, wooden, beautiful ATM. And if you walk up to it, there's a wrestler walking around. And if you touch the keypad that's built into the ATM, the wrestler will pause, and there'll be an overlay of what currency you would like your exchange in. And so listed are 4 countries that the U.S. has militarily intervened in. So Vietnam, the Philippines, Iraq, Nicaragua, all these countries are represented. And then you choose one, and each country has a different choreographed set of wrestling moves that reflect the history with that country. So Vietnam, for example, is brief but really extreme, whereas the Philippines is much longer and has moments of military, like strong movement. But meanwhile, it's just this powerhouse wrestler wrestling by himself to sort of evoke this idea of unnecessary intervention. And then at the end, you get a receipt. The machine prints out a receipt that shows you each year of intervention and how many people, when I was able to get it, how many people died in that intervention. All right.
Thanks again.
Well, thanks very much. Thanks,